There was a guy, he wasn't even a veteran, but it was filled with veterans in there. This guy came like 4 times to our group on Friday night, but he had come because he was struggling with his marriage and a divorce. And in Colorado Springs, 3 weeks ago, he found out his wife had been cheating on him, and he killed himself and his 7-year-old son. It wrecked me, man. My name is Matt Stack. I was in the Marine Corps from 1999 to 2003. I was honorably discharged as a sergeant in '03. So I'm originally from Miami, Florida. Grew up there, went to a Catholic school out there, and then my parents were divorced when I was like 1.5. So spent first kind of half of my life with mom and stepdad in Miami, and then Knoxville, Tennessee, and then went to go spend high school with my dad, his wife, my stepmom, in a small town in Eden, North Carolina. That's where I was recruited, and that's where my family, some of my family still lives, out in North Carolina. And that's kind of where I call home. In Eden, there's not much to do if you've ever been there, at least when I was in high school. There was a Miller brewing plant that was just in town, so most everyone's family worked at Miller Beer. And not just north of that was RJR Tobacco, and you had a textile mill. So for us, there wasn't a lot. The cool thing that people did on Friday nights is they would cruise their cars around the local mall really slow, and that was what people did for fun. So in a small town, there's not much to do, and went to Moorhead High School, and it was a great place to grow up. Some Fridays we would spend going along the roads until we could find someone throwing away an appliance. So either a fridge, a water heater, put it in the back of my buddy's truck, and we would take it down the 2-lane road in the backwoods and either chuck it off while we were driving down the bridge to see it spark up, and then eventually we would chuck it into the river. So I apologize to the city of Eden. If they reach out to me, I'll still deny it. But yeah, the river was probably clogged with a few things we chucked over. So that was growing up in Eden, North Carolina. It was a good place to grow up, but when I graduated, I remember wanting to travel, wanting to get out and see more, but still have a ton of friends there. It's a great place. If you can picture me with weed smoking, puka shell necklace, crazy hair, and Birkenstocks or Doc Martens, I was just this kid who wanted to travel the world and party and have fun. And I had 2 older sisters, and one of them had joined the Army, and she just crushed it. I mean, she was like company honor graduate and was amazing. And at the time, I was working at Blockbuster Video, and I remember my dad came to me and said, "You need to start saving the money you're making at this job for college." And I remember just kind of flippantly saying, no, I didn't want to save my money. I remember just thinking, I'm just going to join the military, just like Jenny, just like my sister. And so that literally, if I could say it was like some big duty to honor, no, it's because I just wanted to travel, have fun. I didn't know what I wanted to do in college. I wanted to spend my money from Blockbuster Video. And so that's how that was like my motivation to join the military. In Eden, there's a local mall that I mentioned. There's only one branch of service in that mall, and it's the Marines. So at the time, if you drove up 45 minutes north to Greensboro, the big city, there was a set there where all 4 branches were side by side in a mall. And so at that time, I was obsessed with explosives, obsessed with fire and wanting to do stuff. And I remember hearing about EOD. And so I remember thinking, that would be awesome. I want to go EOD. So my dad took me up to the recruiters, and I remember going into the Navy recruiter, and he goes, "Oh man, did you hear about all those bombs that we just blew people up with over in the Middle East?" He goes, "Man, that was us." I remember at that moment, I'm like, all right, psycho, like I'm not saying I just want to go blow people up. I mean, that is what bombs are used for, but I think at the time I just didn't make that connection. And I remember going, no, this ain't it. Went to the Air Force. She just handed me like 4 college brochures. And I wasn't going to go Army because my sister just went Army. So at the time, I remember thinking, well, I'm not going to talk to the Marines here because there's one back in my hometown. So I talked to the Navy, talked to the Air Force. And then as we're walking back to our car, there was this like 5-foot sergeant who comes running out the recruiter door from the Marines. And he goes, "Hey there, hard charger." And so, of course, we stop, and he invites us in. And within 5 minutes, I wanted to be a Marine. You have to understand like who I was in high school too. Like, I mean, I was just this kind of pot smoking kid. When I decided to join the Marine Corps, and then the school, I don't remember what we did. We did some kind of rally where the whole school is in the auditorium because it was a tiny town. They were announcing people and what branches of service they were gonna go in. And when they said, and Matt Stack is joining the Marine Corps, the whole school busted out laughing. And I look back and laugh because it's true. I was just this kind of pot smoking kid, like, you know, just chill, like whatever. And my girlfriend at the time, her dad was an old Vietnam vet. And I mean, her and I dated for a long time, through my junior year, senior year, even going into the military. But I remember when I was about to go off, he didn't know I heard him one day. But one day I heard him in the kitchen talking about me going into boot camp, and he goes, Matt'll never make it. And I remember being like, dang. Like, it was kind of like just laugh, you know, you kind of laugh off the school, and then you hear like this guy who knows me said that. And then I remember going to MEPS or whatever, not MEPS, whatever thing you go to where you kind of like, you have to do a bunch of jumping jacks in a room and some doctors just making sure. So I do all that. And this old doctor, he looked like he's 120 years old, pulls me aside and he goes, I don't think you should do this. I was the only one, got pulled aside. He pulled me aside, he goes, you shouldn't do this. He goes, I watched you in there. You were having trouble following directions. You weren't good at what we were doing. You shouldn't do this. So I remember thinking, dang, like everyone was betting against me. But I remember it was kind of a motivation at the time, like to come in. So you kind of like, you know, you're all dramatic when you're a teenager. So I kind of went off to boot camp and I was like, well, I'll either become a Marine, or if I don't make it, I'm just gonna sneak home and grab my stuff and then just leave. Like, I'll be too ashamed. But I was like, all right, this is it. It's the one shot. So everyone was betting against me. I look back on it now and laugh, but yeah, it was a big motivation back then at 18. So I remember when we finally sat with the recruiter, I said, hey, I wanna go EOD. And he goes, great. Yeah, so in order to go EOD, you actually have to sign up for Aviation Ordnance. And just when you get to your school, just tell them you want to go EOD. I was like, all right, let's do that. Aviation Ordnance, I'll build bombs for the planes. And I remember getting to my school and being like, hey, my recruiter told me to tell you, you know, like, my recruiter told me to tell you, I want to go EOD. And he goes, great. Well, when you re-enlist, just put it down. You can't be EOD unless you're at least 4 years in. And I remember just hitting me in that moment. I've already been past boot camp, already went through you're already kind of like going through your schooling. I was like, all right, ordnance it is. And I ended up loving it. I thought I was picking my job, but I mean, if your recruiter didn't lie to you, did you even join? Like, I mean, does anyone have a story where a recruiter didn't lie to them? And then I went off to boot camp after high school, and yeah, the rest is history. This van came to my house to pick me up, said goodbye to my girlfriend, said goodbye to my family, got in the van, and you're kind of just putting one foot in front of the other. I mean, I was scared. And I remember there was a guy local that we were kind of going through the process together. So during like MEPS and things like that, him and I became friends. And they were like, hey, we're gonna work it out where you guys can go to boot camp together. So we're like, that's great. I'll at least go knowing someone, and this will be awesome. And they kind of put you in this like, I don't know if it was like a hotel room for a couple days before you start heading to Parris Island. But I remember in that time, I showed up with my buddy and they were like, hey, you know, we're here to go. And they go, oh, you guys aren't going together. And we were like, no, we did this thing where we're gonna be in the same. They're like, no, Stack, you're gone. And then I just was like by myself, put on the van. So here I'm thinking, I'm like, oh, I'll have some semblance of like, you know, a buddy to kind of feel comfortable around. Nope, it's just me. I mean, when you go to Parris Island, you even go to MCRD, it's always at nighttime. You always rock up, and I don't know, do they just drive around for 12 hours before they make you come in at night? All I remember thinking when we pulled in and I could see the yellow footprints, I remember just thinking like, don't get singled out. Like, just blend in like as much as I can. And I remember some drill instructor came on yelling his head off and then just told us all to get off. I remember it was like a blur. All I remember is just kind of running, putting my feet on the yellow footprints, and then you just kind of just like are birthed into the chaos like in that moment. And I was scared, but I was like, don't do anything stupid. Just follow your orders and keep your head down. This was the best lesson in leadership I remember ever learning. Was there, you would see orders kind of come down from the drill instructors to whatever, we were doing field day, you're pushing all your racks against the wall, you know, whatever. The greatest thing I remember learning about leadership is like, I cannot ask my guys to do anything that I won't do myself. So if the order came down, we were doing it together. And I remember eventually becoming the guide. And I remember getting demoted, put back into the role as guide, because I wanted to be a Marine more than anything by this point. I was committed. And I know guides get all the hate in the world. Like, and so I was like, but I loved it. I loved my crew. There was a couple instances that stood out because I was really blessed. I felt like the hand of God was on me, man, when I was over there. And I was able to graduate boot camp as a Lance Corporal. So I came in, I did 3 years of ROTC prior to joining in high school. And then that gave me a PFC going in, and my senior drill instructor let me come out as a Lance Corporal. So coming back to my school, coming back to see my girlfriend's father, you know, coming back to see all those things was kind of like a nice thing of like coming out as the honor grad. But I remember if there was one moment that probably stood out as to why that kind of like progressed, it was when we were on the rifle range and we were all laying down in the prone position. So it was like, you know, half our platoon's kind of laid out in this big semicircle thing. And we're all just kind of laying there. You're looking, you know, down the iron sights. Our heavy comes over and he goes, "Stack. Who's the worst person in the platoon? Who's the worst recruit in the platoon?" And by then I remember kind of looking out the corner of my eye and I could see everyone like stop and kind of look. And then it was on me. And you know that, all that BS, you know, when you have to talk in third person, and you know, I remember even asking my recruiter, "Oh, I hear they're talking in third person." He's like, "Oh, I've never heard of that." Yeah, they do, they talk. So he goes, "Stack." And we all knew there was one guy we had in mind who was the worst in the platoon. But I don't know what came over me in that moment. I said, "I'm the worst person in the platoon." Or at that time, you know, recruit stack is the worst person in the platoon. And he goes, "Is that right?" And then just kind of paused. And then he walked away. Because had I said any other person's name, it would have been like the greatest leadership fail ever. Even if that person is awful. Like granted, there is an element to tighter units where you don't want someone like that on your team. But in an environment where men are meant to gather around, push someone, and come together, it's different. But had I said any other person's name other than my own, I would have been screwed. My entire platoon would have lost respect for me. That was a big moment. And there was another where we were in the chow hall. And I don't know, I don't remember what happened. I got done eating and I can't remember how it happened. And this other drill instructor, mean as a hornet, called me over and was like, "Stack, get over here." And he took his, you know, his cover off, his Smokey Bear off, and set it down on the table. And he goes, "Grab it." The drill instructor cover was like a sacred piece. You know, no one touches it. No one gets near it. They used to put it under guys doing push-ups. I dare you to touch this thing. He said, "Go ahead, grab it." He goes, "You want to wear it? You want to wear it? You want to put it on? Go ahead, put it on." And I remember just instantly reaching over and grabbing it. And he lost his freaking mind. In fact, 2 other drill instructors appeared out of thin air. I don't even know where they came from. And all 3 of them were just chewing me out in my face, losing it. So everyone, it happens to everyone at some point. He goes, "You haven't learned a freaking thing, have you?" I don't even know where these things came from. But I said, "I just do what you tell me. I don't do what I think I'm supposed to do." And he goes, "Is that right?" You know, it's like one of those ones like, and then just, "Get away from me, get," and just like, because at the time it's like, we were trained, just follow orders. We don't understand at the time like that, you know, this is what you do. You follow orders, you just do it instantly and you don't question it. Like it's not until you're supposed to be a corporal that you question things and you're the one giving orders. And there's this whole thing that you don't even process at the time. Those are like 2 moments that stood out where there was something about those that was probably I put, you know, blessing of God all over me there, but I was scared. I didn't know things about myself. I was trying to figure things out. You're just kind of in a chaotic environment every day. And looking back, you laugh at it, but gosh, it feels like forever. It feels like you were there for a year and it was like 12 weeks. So at the time, we were one of the earlier platoons to do the Crucible. The Crucible had come in. So we had finished, I remember that Heavy, I want to say, was the one who gave it to me. And of course, they're playing that song, I'm proud to be an American, you know, and every dude is crying there. But I remember holding my hand out when he handed it to me. It was one of the best feelings ever at that time. It felt like there's not a lot of moments where you feel worthy, like you feel accepted, you feel like a part of something, like an official moment. You might become friends with someone, you might join something, but there isn't like a moment of so much pain leading up to this moment of like acceptance into a brotherhood. And I think at that time, it immediately seals like a part of your identity. It's not like something you do, it's like who you are now. And it's hard to explain that to people. Everyone goes off to their different schools or different MOSs, but like in that moment, everyone is a part of the same brotherhood. And the drill instructors, there was a moment they were still, they backed off a ton after that. They were still, on you about stuff, but it was different after that point. I actually remember, I don't know why, but at the time when you had your cereal box in the chow hall, you had to eat it out of the box. You had to open up the plastic bag and pour the milk into the box. Yes, you couldn't use a bowl. Like, you don't deserve a bowl. I don't remember. And I remember we got to the chow hall after that, and I started chewing out my guys for using a bowl. But then I got corrected. They were like, no, you can. Oh, there was another one I do remember. I can't fully remember if that's how it all played out in the shop, but I do remember when we got back to the squad bay, we were never allowed to sit down to put our boots on. You just put your boots on. Sitting down was like, I don't know what it is. They would not let you sit down. So after we became Marines, it was like, you still have a week where you're in boot camp before you go home, which is torture because you're just kind of going through these crazy motions and learning different things. But I remember 2 guys in my platoon started sitting down to put their boots on, and I started correcting them right then. Like, stand up, put your boots on, and a drill instructor came out and put me in my place. He's like, no, they can sit down. They can put their boots on. And I remember just kind of being, it was like a moment of me being like, oh man, it's like, you kind of get indoctrinated in this way. You're still acting like a recruit, but I had to unlearn other stuff too. So after boot camp, I hated the idea of leadership. I remember thinking how many times I got punished for things my platoon did. And in Parris Island, you're getting eaten alive by sand fleas all the time. And so part of their punishment is they would just leave you outside and let them eat you alive. And if anyone in the platoon moved, you're there longer. And it was torture. It was awful. I hated it. And to this day, if a bug lands on me, I still will freak out. And like, I just hated it. But I remember getting to MCT thinking, this is 17 days of just in the woods in winter in North Carolina. I'm not gonna stand out. I don't wanna be a class leader. I don't wanna be a platoon leader. I just wanna get through this. And I remember ended up getting pneumonia when you were there. I remember just trying to hide amongst the ranks. And at the time we all had camis, you could barely see the chevrons. So no one could see that I had crossed rifles. But I remember, I don't know why this even happened, but at some point we had to leave the field and all of us had to go to this giant laundromat and pick up our khaki shirts from the cleaners there. So the instructors, like 2 or 3 sergeants, are there with us. We're all there to pick up our shirts, and you could see this giant rack. I mean, it could hold like 100 shirts on it. And you could see everyone's sleeves sticking out. And you could see private PFC as far as you could see, and then there was one set of crossed rifles that stood out. And I remember the instructors were so pissed because they were like, who the F here is a Lance Corporal? And I was like, of course I'm like, I am. And they just dressed me down in front of everyone, chewed me out. I can't believe you would let these PFCs and privates come, tell you what to do and blah, blah, blah. And I remember just being like, whatever. Like, you can chew me out, I don't care. Like, I'm not buying into this, the game that you're doing. But I remember looking back, I was kind of like, gosh, I treated it wrong. Like, it was an opportunity to, to lead and to do things. So I remember just like trying to survive again. It was selfish. But I remember, gosh, they were pissed. And then from there, then we went off to Pensacola and our school and then eventually the fleet. Got assigned to Iwakuni, Japan. So I got to go to the malls out there in Japan on mainland. So Iwakuni is like 45 minutes kind of south of Hiroshima. And I ended up going out there. I don't even remember what it was like checking in. I don't even have that memory of like walking in. I remember my buddy who I became friends with, we were on the same flight. We get out there and you kind of just are looking like, I remember immediately you wanted to go out into town. You wanted to get as far away from base as possible, to experience Japan, to find a girlfriend, whatever. You're just like, let's go look for some girls. Let's go look for some alcohol. Like, you just immediately are like, how far away from town can we get? And that became my duty station for 2 years. So I ended up spending like half my time there. So I got there in September of 2000, September 2000. And then it was in Japan a year later. We were all going to bed and my buddy came in and he was like, dude, you got to turn on the TV. And so I remember turning on the TV and you had seen both towers had been hit on 9/11. And then by then we all kind of gathered in one room, one barracks room, and we were watching it. And I remember watching it just like, none of us even said a word, just watching it. And then when we saw the Pentagon hit, then I remember feeling like, kind of like fearful. I remember thinking, oh man, this is real. Like there's an actual attack going down in my country. And then I don't know who thought of it. It was very clever. But immediately after that, they showed a video of people celebrating in the Middle East. And man, everyone in that room switched really quick from being afraid to being like beyond pissed. Like it was like the fear had left and it was just anger and we were ready to go to war. So within 3 hours, the thing had started at 10. Yeah, by about maybe like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, we were formed up outside and they were trying to figure out who in the platoon had people over in New York, or not platoon, in the unit, who in there was over in New York. We were formed up and then 3 days later was my 21st birthday and they put me on a plane to Guam. And Guam was like the first station that they had set up the staging for the war. I mean, it moved so fast. When we got to Guam, the entire flight line was filled. The runway was filled with every C-5, C-130, C-17. I mean, it was just nothing but planes. And we weren't even allowed to leave the base for 2 weeks. We were just building ordnance after ordnance. Being in Guam was one of the most beautiful places I had been. We ended up getting our scuba license out there when we could finally go out into town. You go underwater and it's like this. And I remember you had to be careful because I remember we were drunk walking around town and we were walking from one place to another, one bar to this other place, and me and my buddies, and this girl passed us like 3 times. She kept looking and then finally I'm kind of like throwing my hands up like, hey, like pick us up, we're right here. So she ends up pulling up. And as soon as we run up, I yell shotgun. My 2 buddies jump in the back seat. And it was weird. The back seat kind of had these like weird pillows and cushions and things. It was just this, I remember thinking, what? So I get in and I immediately, before I even looked at the person, I was like, thank you so much. What's your name? And the dude who was wearing a wig and makeup with the biggest Adam's apple I've ever seen turns to me, he's like, Greg. His name's Greg. He's like, where are you going? We're like, a block away, right there. Just, actually, you can let us out right now. Like, thanks. And so that was a big thing in Guam, is these dudes who would dress in drag would go around and find drunk Marines and do stuff to them. Like, it was we got warned about it. I mean, I wouldn't say warned about it, but it was just known. Be careful when you got into town, because they'll find you. They would try to drug them at some point and take advantage of them. And so there'd been stories of Marines getting picked up by someone and going with them and getting drugged and who knows what, and so we just kind of found out later. If you ended up finding, anyone, I ended up, meeting a great person out there who showed me a ton of places around Guam. And I mean, that was it. If you could find a person who was local, who could show you great things, I mean, man, I remember going even into Japan, meeting a local there who took me into like secret like bars and clubs and things that just no one even knew about. Going to Mount Fuji, like we had great experiences. Guam was a lot of drinking, a lot of partying. There was even a place where a beach, one of the best beaches in Guam, was actually on base. And if you go out far enough, there was a coral reef, but there was a strong riptide. And I remember me and my buddy were just out there swimming, and I remember just watching his body swim and then just take off sideways towards the reef. I remember grabbing him and pushing back and thinking nothing of it. And then a Marine died at that same reef 2 weeks later. And so the riptide was so strong. So next thing you know, of course, they're banning Marines from going out into beaches and banning people. And I think the Marines' response to everything, you know, a Marine getting hurt, Marine getting killed, was always an extreme example, because, you know, these commanding officers in charge, they can't have something like that there. So they're going to go to the extreme to handle that. Like, no Marines are allowed out in town for the next month. And you're like, really? Like, okay, thanks a lot. So we were only in Guam 3 months. And so we went in right after 9/11. We were there about 3 months. When we came back from Guam, we went back to Japan. You know, the war was kind of building. And from there, there was a deployment coming up to Kuwait. And so they wanted to do a big stage out there in Kuwait. And I got slated again for it. And so ended up going to Guam. So ultimately, from Japan, I went to Australia first, then Guam, then Kuwait last. And so Kuwait was, gosh, man, it was like the hottest place I had ever been in my life. I'd not been used to, 115-degree days. And so we got there and were there out there 3 months, and that ended up becoming a staging for even more. So we ended up doing 12 on, 12 off. So you're building bombs, getting everything set for 12 hours, sleep, go back to your tent, and then 12 on, 12 off each day. When you look back, it was good times. I will say, we were on an Air Force base, and man, did they have the greatest chow hall I've ever been to in my entire life. You basically did your job, went to the gym, ate, and like that was your life, like just day in and day out. But it was just a lot of bomb building, a lot of waiting, a lot of hanging around. We were back where the F-18s were kept, so there wasn't gonna be a ton. I mean, we still had places, they still had the warnings, they still had everything, but we weren't really in a place where there was gonna be a ton of attacks coming in, or there was a lot of things to mitigate that. It was just a lot of work and working out. It's probably the best shape I've ever been in my entire life, was that day. The life on Kuwait was a decent sized base, but there was a lot of third country nationals that were always on the base. So they were kind of like workers from out in town that they would pay like $1 a day to come and dig a ditch, to do different various things. And you weren't allowed to drink the water on base, so everything had to be from bottled water. So you had to have water all the time, and you would never sweat over there. It was just so dry, so hot, you wouldn't even know. So if you were dehydrated, you were done. The silver bullet was coming for you. And so, that ended up being, as far as Kuwait goes, it was great. But I remember we were allowed to go out into town by this point. So me and my sergeant and my staff sergeant, I remember would go out. Remember there was a Chili's that we went to out in Kuwait. The only thing I remember is at one point I just started walking around town by myself. I said, I'll catch up with them in a minute, and the Persian Gulf was right there, and I'm by myself, and of course I stand out like a sore thumb, and I go walk to the end of this pier, and it was beautiful, and there was a man out there fishing with his son, and he walked up to me, and he goes, and he saw me, and after a few minutes he walked up to me, and he goes, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you in the military?" I said, "Yeah." And then he didn't say another word. He just turned around and walked off. And he whispered something to his son, and then he started walking off the pier. And I was like, crap. I was like, I already know. Like, he's gonna go tell someone. So then, of course, I followed him off the pier, found my sergeant, my staff sergeant. I'm like, sorry, guys, we gotta go. We ended up just leaving. And then that pier ended up getting bombed. Chili's is gone. All of it's gone. It was a nice time at that time. So it was nothing too crazy. Like, we didn't get messed with too much. They had big warnings, but eventually you weren't allowed out in town. When we were over there, there was a lot of Air Force girls on Al Jaber and a lot of Marine men. And so there was a lot of hookups, a lot of sex, a lot of connections that would happen between the two. And so no one thought much of it. It just thought like, oh, this person met this person, they're hooking up. And, you know, at the time, but later on, years later, I heard about the brothel set up from the Air Force girls, and it wasn't a surprise. I was like, oh yeah, because they had a separate area where it was just theirs, and you would see Marines going in and out. That was the old me. I mean, I look back, like for me, my faith journey of what started my mental health, what got into it, like I became a Christian and accepted Jesus in my C school. And I remember thinking at the time, like, all right, like I'm believing that there's this guy, Jesus, I'm gonna become a Christian. But I remember thinking I was worse off after that than I was before. I was still sleeping around. I was still doing stuff. I didn't have community. I didn't have a brotherhood. And I do remember there was a guy who happened to be with me in Japan. He happened to be with me in Australia. And then he got sent to Kuwait with me. And he was always talking to me about God. And I'll never forget, he would want to hang out in Australia, but I didn't want to. I wanted to go party. I wanted to go be with my buddies out to the bar and meet girls. And then in Kuwait, he said something to me and I hadn't thought of it before. He goes, Matt, he goes, God is chasing after you. He goes, you got to remember, man, being a Christian is like being a piece of coal. You know, that piece of coal can catch on fire for God, but it can only burn so hot. You have to put that piece of coal around a bunch of other pieces of coal that they'll create a fire that nothing can come near. He goes, you need fellowship, man. You need like a good community. And he was right. I was by myself on everything. And that led into the whole journey of my mental health getting out, of meeting people, of having a community, feeling alone. There was just this huge thing that I wasn't ready to address yet. So at the time, I was searching to fill this hole in my heart. So I thought, yeah, sleeping around, you know, going out partying, doing the things I wanted to do when I was younger, maybe it will fill this hole that I feel like I have inside of me. And nothing filled it, nothing. And it wasn't until I became a Christian and found a purpose and a community where I was like, I get it now. Like, I feel like a whole person. And that was the first time. At the time I was in Miramar, that was when I was getting out. And there's a guy who comes and does our TAPS class, and he's done it for years. And my TAPS class to get out was a guy who came and told us how to collect unemployment in 2 different states and not let the government know about it. So that was the official base class. Like, hey, here's how you collect unemployment in California and Maryland, where the government won't even know. And they were like, see you later. You have to remember too, in 2003 when I got out, the words mental health wasn't even a thing. Like, suicide wasn't even really a thing. It wasn't until I got a call in 04, 05, and my buddy said, hey man, I just want to let you know Major Cochran killed himself. I remember thinking, what? So Major Cochran was my first commanding officer in Iwakuni. And I remember him vividly because at the time, my first thing I had to do in Iwakuni was work in the master gun's office. And they shared a wall with Major Cochran. And Major Cochran used to bang on the wall for me to come over. And the master guns would be like, sit right there, Marine. He would say, he would never let me get up from a banging on the wall. Like he was like, you're not like a dog. Like even though that's the commanding officer, the master guns was like, sit your ass down. Like don't get up. But I remember always having to go eventually into the major's office to work with him and find out stuff and do whatever he wanted. Years later, found out he was the first suicide where he killed himself on the golf course after he retired. And I remember thinking, why? Like, why would he do that? And then one by one, you heard about more and more over the years, and it became this thing. So transition out was really hard for me. Even though I had never seen combat, it's funny is when I got out and you meet guys who had seen combat, early on, you kind of enter in this place of like, oh man, I wish I had gone to combat. I wish I had fought. I wish I had seen combat. Oh no, I'm kind of thankful I didn't. And you kind of end up in this place. And you know what I've kind of attributed to is now is when I hear someone say, oh, I wish I was in combat. It's the same thing as someone saying, oh man, I wish I came from an abusive family. You're like, anyone who's been in an abusive family would be like, no, you don't. I promise you, you don't wish you were in an abusive family. Just be grateful that you weren't and be honoring to those who were. Like it's really simple. And so I don't feel that way. I'm thankful for the time that I had. I'm thankful I was a Marine. But I'm eternally grateful for guys who've done stuff more than I've done, who've sacrificed more than I've sacrificed. Even guys who've been over there, it's not so much that they care whether someone has or not. There is a level of respect that they'll have to someone who's done the same, but they just care that people stay in their lane. I stay in my lane. I wasn't in combat. I don't know what it's like over there. I know what the effects of it could do, and I've counseled many men on that. My wife and I used to be pastors at one point, and I've counseled tons of people through that on a spiritual aspect. But I don't know what it's like to be over there, to get shot at, how I'd react. Even for the special forces people, even for people who are grunts, everything, they just want people to know, just stay in your lane. Be grateful and be honoring to those who did. And even after that, the transition for me was really hard. This is where I get into the deep part. I would say there was about a 7-year period when I got out where I felt like everybody was better at life than me in everything. They had better relationships than me. They made more money than me. Like they're in better shape than me. In just every area, I felt like I just wasn't measuring up. And it was incredibly frustrating. And at the time, you never make the connection, you don't know what it is. I just felt like I sucked at life. I felt like I was alone. I had a buddy at the time. I was working at this place, like selling loans, and he was also a Marine. And I remember one day he came to me and he said he wanted to leave his fiance. He had a great fiance, great girl. And he wanted to leave her to get back with his ex, who's crazy. And he wanted to get back with her because the sex was great and the passion was there and all this stuff. And I remember just unleashing on him, just cussing him out, going off on him, and telling him how he's brainwashed, everything. And it wasn't until later that I realized I was projecting what I felt about myself onto him. Because how I felt is because I was brainwashed. I was destroying things. And it was when God had kind of opened up this thing for me. And I realized what led to the biggest, work that I've done with veterans is this realization. And I feel like the way it works is the Marine Corps, the military teach us to love a life of chaos and things going wrong. It's like we pride ourselves on things going wrong. I can remember time after time things would fall apart, not come through, and we would just kind of laugh it off and wear it like a badge. And no one ever thinks about it, and we just get used to that environment. But the problem is that when we get out, we're so used to things going wrong that when we get into like a loving relationship, a peaceful, quiet home, you see guys that just start to it's like they're squirming, like something's wrong. It's like they're anticipating something going wrong. And the way that they process it is by subconsciously ruining their life. So they're in a relationship with a great girl, something's wrong or something's about to go wrong, I better destroy it. I'm in a peaceful, loving home, something is about to go wrong, I better destroy it. And they never make the connection. This is all subconscious. Because we get so used to the chaotic environment, we learn to thrive in it. And then we learn to do well, and we learn to love it. And so I realized this, and it hit me like a ton of bricks, is that I was self-sabotaging my life in every area. So I started going along. This time I was traveling, and I would wait till I came across a veteran, and I would share my story with them about the self-sabotage. And I would one by one watch their faces just drop. And some of them would cry. And I remember thinking, oh man, I'm not the only one who feels like this. I just became like my mission. And you have to understand too, I avoided veterans for a long time because I was like, oh man, all you guys do is talk about your service. Can't you figure out life? Why is life so hard for you? Blah, blah, blah. And then when I realized I was projecting again how I felt about myself onto them, because life was hard for me, because I talked about my service, because I couldn't figure it out. It's like once I made that connection, it's like my heart just broke. And I was like, oh my gosh, how many guys out there, how many girls need this help? I started telling people and made it my mission to kind of go about this. And it led to me going to this conference, and I meet this retired master sergeant and his wife. So of course I tell my testimony of, self-sabotage, kind of how I worded it. And I remember the wife just starts crying. And she goes, he's been doing that for 25 years. But they just never made the connection that is probably because of the military life. At the time, I told it to another guy who's the military pastor over this church. And I tell him my testimony, and he gets all wide-eyed, hardly says a word, and walks off. And he comes back hours later and he goes, I can't stop thinking about what you said to me about the self-sabotage. I'm like, I know. And then that master sergeant pulled me aside and goes, listen, man, what you said to me was a revelation. He goes, but now what? And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, he's right. Like here I'm thinking that, it's going to be enough to just tell these guys about what the trigger is, but it's not. So I remember thinking at the time, you know what? I need a way to guide these veterans out. And so I started thinking, all right, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book on what veterans should do to get out of that. And I remember telling that pastor, and I said, hey man, I think I'm going to write a book. And he goes, oh, I need that book right now. Bro, I've never written a book. I don't want to write a book. I just want to go home and play PlayStation when my kids are asleep. So God put that on my heart to write it. And I spent a couple months writing my book, Killing Chaos. The moment you're on the yellow footprints, the moment you're being yelled at, they purposely were going to create an environment much like a wartime environment. You don't know what things are coming, when they're coming. You just need to focus on what your superior is telling you to do. This person's yelling, this is doing this. I'm commanding you to have a task. Your task is to put all of your items on your rack and then take them off and put them in the back, whatever. While they're yelling at you, doing it the whole time. And the whole thing is designed for when we go to war and things are going, you are trained just to focus on the one thing that they're telling me. I am completing a task. But it carries into every environment. When you get to your units, it's just like that all the time. You didn't get this part, this broke. This command that just came down is a horrible command. It doesn't make any sense. And it's always just a constant lifestyle. So by the time you're in the fleet or you're at your duty station, you're accustomed. You're used to things going wrong. And let's be honest, it's an environment that isn't conducive to a quiet home life. There was a saying that went around, if the Marine Corps wanted you to have a wife, we would have issued you one. But then at the same time, all of the leaders in the Marine Corps are like, man, we can't figure out why so many marriages are ending. Well, you can't have both. Now, would I change anything? I wouldn't change anything. The Marine Corps, how it functions, and the military, American military is the best in the world for a reason, for that training. We exist for that purpose. But what upsets me is there's no transition out. Like, you know what the transition is like? It's like guys walking up the steps of a building. And then when they get to the end of the building, there's just a door that lets them walk out. And they're like, because let's be honest, the moment you tell your unit you want to get out, you're dead to them. They're staying in, you're getting out. Cool, go do it, good luck. And there's something about it. There isn't a transition. Even planes start descending well before the runway. So there isn't a mental health aspect for that. And so I've been working, my last job, I was actually at a mental health clinic for veterans as their outreach. And then on my free time, I run a course at my church to help veterans overcome combat trauma. And if you really want to know, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, you ready? In the course that I run, there's a course that I heard about called Reboot. And Reboot was a way for veterans to overcome trauma, combat trauma. You don't even have to have gone to combat. You can take this course. And it's essentially a process of walking people through this journey of dealing with what they saw and getting healed. And it's a phenomenal course. And I want to say there's been like 13,000 graduates and like 0 suicides. Because to me, what I learned is mental health starts in the soul. Because the premise, what they came up with is, if a person can go to war and their body can experience trauma, their mind can experience trauma, and all these elements, can it be wounded? Well, then can the soul be wounded? And if the soul can be wounded, can it be healed? So don't get me wrong, I worked at a mental health clinic that was not a Christian-based clinic. There wasn't a spiritual aspect to it. But I would still refer vets there all the time because I love what they did and what they do. But to me, sometimes I encounter people who it is a spiritual thing that you're facing. It is a demonic attack against you. Like when a vet says, I hear voices telling me to kill myself, that's real. That's not in your head. That's not something that just happens. That's not like a chemical imbalance. That is a real presence. Because to me, good versus evil, God versus devil, that stuff is real. And from what I've experienced, there has to be dealt with a certain way. Sometimes you have to bring in spiritual weapons to those things in order to encounter it. And that's just how it's designed. We ran people through this course all the time, and you watch what they go through to overcome it. And as I started doing this, as I started helping veterans go through their mental health journey, it kind of struck me, because when I wrote my book, I'm like kind of going through this, and then when I'm helping them go through what they saw in Afghanistan or did, here I'm thinking that was going to be the focus to help them. But I came to find out almost every veteran I worked with had childhood trauma. And the childhood trauma actually drove you to join the military, because it was a means of order. It was positioned as a place of order, but it's not. It's a place of chaos. And it's a place where you're used to thriving. And so I was on a podcast a while back, and the girl had said something that still rocks me to this day. She said, "Oh yeah, recruiters will target those zip codes." If you want to know why recruiters put themselves in certain areas, it's because that demographic would have the most abuse. And they know that they can come to that person as a means of saving them and bringing them to a place of order. Now, does it have order? Absolutely. Does it find purpose? Absolutely. But if that stuff isn't dealt with, it will be exponentially worse on the back end, because no one is helping them deal with their trauma. A perfect example, I had a buddy of mine who took my course. We weren't friends at the time. He joined my course. Him and his wife came. And one night we're going through the trauma of what experienced is, and he stood up and he said, "I want to share something with you guys." This is about halfway through the course. And he said, "I've never shared this with someone before." He said, when I was in Afghanistan, he was driving a Humvee. A mom and her son crossed the street, and he ran them over. He just plowed right over them. And it wrecked him, destroyed him internally. And he tried to kind of share that with some of the guys in his unit, but those guys disowned him. They were like cussing him out, telling him to just get over it, to move on. There was like a hatred there. And it was amazing though, when he shared that, you have to understand this guy, when he joined, he talked fast all the time. Everything was fast, always moving, always going, always moving, always going. And then when he shared that, his wife didn't even know. She was in the room. We're all hearing this for the first time. But it was amazing as we were brought in a way for God to heal that area of his life. It was like the cadence of his voice slowed down. It was it's like he could finally breathe, because he was ashamed of it. I mean, how do you come back? How do you come back and be a dad? How do you come back and be a dad to your kids, knowing man, I killed a mother and her kid? And you can justify it whatever you want. You can say whatever purpose you want, but that stuff sticks to you. A good friend of mine out here, he's a retired Major General. He's an Army Ranger. We talk about this stuff a lot. And he said, we met at church, and he said, guys are being sent off to war to fight the kingdom of darkness, and stuff is sticking to them. And no one is equipped to handle it, or the people who are, they're not equipped to take it off of them when they come home. And so here these guys are just dying internally. Now, do some guys have mental aspects that just need dealing with? You have some behavioral patterns, you have some firing that's going on in your brain that's making you go back into certain habits? Sure, it could just be a mental thing that you need help with. But for some, there's a doorway that's been opened. There's a spiritual attack that you are facing that's coming against you. And now you actually need spiritual weapons on how to handle that. And so it's a difference of authority. So let's take for a minute on right, about Jesus, about Christianity, mental health, spiritual stuff. What authority does is, let's say a doorway has been opened like that, on death, on anything, and now this person is being tormented. There's a torment coming on them, telling them to kill themselves, telling them to hurt people, whatever the case. There now needs to be someone with authority who comes in. So in a restaurant, picture you and I were in a restaurant, and I just stood up and I said, everyone, I need you all to leave this restaurant right now. My name's Matt. Leave this restaurant. No one would do it. They would look at me like I was crazy. But if I stood up and I held up a badge and I said, everyone, my name is Officer Stack. I'm with the police department. I need you all to get up and leave this restaurant immediately. Everyone would do it, because they recognize the authority that the badge carries. So if there is a spiritual authority, if there's a spiritual kingdom, there would be someone whose authority you must operate under. So what Christianity provides and what Jesus provides is the name that would be above every name, where you are praying over someone and commanding those spiritual elements to leave, and dealing with the trauma, working out forgiveness, and what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And so for the healing that we've seen through these men and women, it'll change your life, man. And it doesn't mean suicide still doesn't touch. I have a Friday night jiu-jitsu group. There was a guy, he wasn't even a veteran, but it was filled with veterans in there. This guy came like 4 times to our group on Friday night, but he had come because he was struggling with his marriage and a divorce. And in Colorado Springs, 3 weeks ago, he found out his wife had been cheating on him, and he killed himself and his 7-year-old son. It wrecked me, man. I was weeping in my office. I'm like, man, this guy came. He was like in the circles praying. And so there's a battle being had out there. There's a fight, and we just can't stop. And then people could say over there, look, there's tons of elements and tons of aspects to everything, but we have to keep fighting, keep doing everything. If I can get someone into an environment where they come in and they're willing to have these things addressed, willing to go through it, man, I've seen freedom like you've never seen on people before. And it'll change you. You're like, that's what this person needs. There's guys who wake up every night at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night, can't sleep. Their thoughts go to horrible places throughout the day. That's real, man. That's a spiritual thing attacking someone. And there's a way to deal with it. I won't go too down the rabbit hole on this, but in Christianity, there would be something that we would call the baptism of the Holy Spirit, where there's a big divide. A lot of people don't know this, but in Christianity, if there was a pendulum and swinging, there would be on the swing over here where people would believe, do not believe in this. Do not believe in the baptism part. Do not believe in gifts and miracles and the spiritual side. And then the other side of the swing would. And so where there's deliverance, where there's healings, where there's miracles, and obviously both can become extreme and can come with horrible examples. But what a person would need is a community. There's a great book called Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You. And in the book, they talk about a study that was done for people who had trauma and how many programs were created for people to deal with trauma. And in every single case, 100% of the programs eventually failed in healing with trauma. But what they found, the #1 indicator of a person who has going through that to become healed on the back end is if they were welcomed into healthy families, if they had a community. So what does a veteran need? They need Jesus, but they need a great community. I had gotten saved, no community. I was worse off than I was before. Or if you're just around in a community and you're not submitting to the authority, you're still missing out on a thing. There's a process. So when I wrote my book, I mean, I could barely call it a book. It's like 60 some odd pages. But it was like a journey that I could take veterans through on that, of how to go through this, of finding the right church. Because a lot of people don't know, think about it like this. You brush your teeth every day. You floss every day. You do everything every day, but plaque still builds up in there, no matter what, no matter all the stuff you do every day. So eventually you have to go to someone who has specialized tools, a dentist, specialized tools, specialized knowledge, and how to remove that. So what does a vet need to do? Get plugged into a great church, a spirit-filled church, and be able to allow people to speak in with them and deal with that stuff and break through that stuff. Almost all the cases that I work with of people, it involves some level of forgiveness of someone who hurt them. Every veteran, we want retribution. We want justice. We want to bring an attack back to them tenfold, because that's what we're trained to do. If the enemy attacks us, we're going to bring an attack tenfold. But it doesn't work in the civilian life on an individual level. And I'm not talking about justice. Like, let's say your father sexually abused you, or someone sexually abused you in your home. Should justice be there? Absolutely. The person should be in jail and the electric switch thrown, in my personal opinion. But in terms of forgiveness, what is forgiveness and what is it? So C.S. Lewis had a great quote. He said, forgiveness is like drinking poison, hoping the other person dies. It's like forgiveness. It's like me drinking poison, hoping that person dies for what they did to me. It's just going to hurt me. And that person probably doesn't even remember. So what forgiveness is simply It's not letting a person off the hook. It's simply making a decision. That what I'm doing is I'm saying, I am making a decision that no longer what you did will I let affect me anymore. I'm letting you go. Now, also what it isn't, it does not mean that I have to continue a relationship with this person. A lot of people think I got abused by someone, a husband, a wife, or someone, and you kind of go through this and you think, okay, I still have to be around them. I still have to invite them over. If they're family, so I guess we have to invite them over. No, you don't. There's nothing saying that. Biblically, there's a scripture that says, honor your father and mother because with it comes long life. And it's the only command that comes with long life. So there's a level of honor that still comes with parents, regardless of what they did or didn't. But it does not mean you have to maintain a relationship with them. Because to me, once you come to that place of where you can let that forgiveness go, like release it and forgive that person, man, it's like the first time people can start to experience healing. I've spent a long time thinking about the thank you for your service. People say, thank you for your service, thank you for your service. But for me, when people say it to me, I just picture me like drunk in a bar in Iwakuni. I'm like, my service wasn't as intense as other guys. So the term thank you for your service kind of loses its thing. And what do you say to a guy who you see him with missing both his legs? I mean, thank you for your service just doesn't kind of cut it. And I've thought a long time about this, and even thank you for your sacrifice doesn't seem to cut it anymore. And I was trying to think, what would I say? What would I say to someone to let them know I'm grateful to you for what you did for my country and for my family and for my freedom? And the best thing I can think of to say to someone was, hey, I just want to let you know my children will remember what you did. Because it just lets them know, like, I'm acknowledging what you did, and I'll make sure the next generation of my kids are a way to honor you. But honor's a funny thing. I've seen vets become in a weird debt trap to honor. Another one of my buddies who took my course, ended up becoming friends with him. He never said a word for probably 9 weeks of a 12-week course, hardly a word. And then one day he opened up, told us how he was a rescue pilot, and he would go, his job was to go and pick up the remains of men and women who had been killed. Sometimes the remains would be in one body, sometimes they'd be in pieces scattered. And it was him and his team's job to go and collect those, put them on the plane. So not only was he dealing with that level of death, but also 10 of his friends died within a year. And he's going to all their funerals, seeing all their kids at the funerals, just destroying him. So if you met him, he had the metal bracelet on, that'd been silver from worn down. He just was in this place where I'm not doing enough to honor them. And he was trapped. He was like, I'm not doing enough. Maybe I should do more. I'm running this 5K coming up. I'm doing this. What am I doing? And it kind of just hit me, and I said, let me ask you something, man. If all 10 of those people who you lost were here right now, and they were standing in front of you, and you were to say to them, hey, what could I do to best honor you and the sacrifice you made? What would it be if I started a nonprofit that helped veterans and their families and named after you guys and did whatever? If I did all that, would that be enough to honor you? If I started a nonprofit, if I ran the 5Ks, and if I did this and I helped more people, if I did all this, would that be enough to honor you? What would be the thing that would bring you the most honor? I said, do you know what all 10 of those people would say? They would say, the greatest thing you could do to honor me would be go be a great husband, go be a great father, enjoy your freedom and enjoy your life. That would be the greatest thing you could do to honor me. There isn't a debt tied to it. Now, should you run the 5Ks? Absolutely. Should you tell your kids and tell the story and, create the nonprofit? Yes, but it isn't tied to a debt. Like every one of those people would have wanted you to enjoy your life. So I'm all for honoring, but sometimes there's a way to do it that's healthy and sustainable. There's a way to do it where you feel like you are trapped in something. And so for me, it would be I will make sure to tell my kids what you did.